Good morning. We're at getting the second to last week of our study of Joshua. And we've spent 11 lessons over 15 weeks. And the more I read, the more I study, the more I'm convinced we could easily spend 30 weeks. So I just encourage you to do your own study, to read, and remember this, especially Mari and Carol Ann, always study the Bible with a calculator in one hand and a map in the other. Okay. Last week, before we get into this week, we're going to be in the 11th chapter of Joshua, do a little bit also in 14 and 15. But for those of you who weren't here, and for those who may forget, we're running it up to the end of the conquest of the land. And Israel has begun crossing the Jordan, and then they have captured the two fortresses that guard the pass that goes up to the highlands. And in so doing, Joshua has captured the high ground, he split the country in half, and he controls the main road north and south throughout Israel. He then, by way of Mount Ebal and Gerizim, we talked about that, he moved the nation's camp to a centrally located Gilgal. And about that time, if you recall, the city-state of Gibeon, a strong fortified city, made peace with Joshua. Even though it was by subterfuge, they are the only city in all of Canaan that made peace. And we talked a little about that. Then, because they had defected to Israel's side, about 5 kings in these blue circles here, you see them, they gathered their armies together under the leadership of the king of Jerusalem, and they attacked not Israel, but Gibeon. Israel came to their aid because of their alliance, and then Joshua routed all 5 armies, and it drove them down a narrow pass to Beth Horon, where much of the slaughter occurred, and that's why it's sometimes called the Battle of Beth Horon. And after they finally clambered over the cliffs here, the whole army started to disperse down the road to Azekah, and then down to Makkedah, which were fortified cities. Obviously, all the soldiers are trying to get back to the fortresses so they would be safe. And even while they were out here in the open, God gave him an assist by sending hailstones. And it said that the hailstones killed more of the enemy than Joshua's army did. And then in the cleanup, that was the situation where God allowed the sun to stand still and extended the day about a full day. So miraculous things happened. Then once Joshua had pursued them all the way to Makkedah, you remember there are 5 kings who were in a cave. He brought them out, he executed them, and then one by one, he began to reduce the fortified cities of the south. And we're told about 6 of them. There were probably quite a few more and lesser towns and things like that he covered. There was also the army of the king of Gezer came down to help, and they defeated him. So pretty much Joshua has pacified the center of the land of Canaan, and he's gained control over the southern portion, with the one exception here of the land of the Philistines. And that will be a problem for Israel all the way hundreds of years later to David, and also the city fortress of Jerusalem, which we'll see in a minute. That's where the Perizzites and the Hittites operate. So the defeat of those kings has gotten some attention, right? You would expect that. All the kings of the north, remember, these are all city-states. Every city has a king, and then they dominate the villages and the towns round about, and it's kind of a feudal system. And those towns provide revenue, and they provide soldiers, and then they're always at war with one another. So that explains partially why they've taken so long to combine forces. But after Joshua conquered the south, they became very, very concerned. So let's take it up in chapter 11, verses 1 to 5.
When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Akshaph, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Naphoth Dor on the west, to the Canaanites to the east and west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel.
Now, I know when you read these passages, there's theseites and thoseites and themsites and all that, and it kind of gets confusing. So this is where a map does help. The cities of Madon, Shimron, and Aksaph are here. Here's Hazor, that's the leader. And then Madon, Shimron, and Aksaph were there. And then they have all the kings in the northern hill country. Now, you need to know something about the geography of Israel. Israel has the hill country, which is where most of the action occurs in the Bible. And these are the mountains, this ridge of mountains on the western side of the Great Rift Valley of the River Jordan and between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan. Now, that is cut in half by something we know as the Jezreel Valley. And you can see that there's a southern hill country and a northern hill country. Now, Joshua has taken care of the southern hill country already, right? And this valley sort of cuts that in two. And you may notice that the fortress of Megiddo is on the ridge of that valley. And what does that make you think of? Armageddon, right. So that's where the great congregation of Armageddon will occur. So the northern hill country would be up in this region here. It talks about kings of the lowlands out to Naphoth Dor. Well, Dor is the beach. It's a resort city to this very day. So out to this beach from over here, all these people in the lowlands were completely included. And then you had, it says the Canaanites east and west. Now, we don't know what that means, except it probably means anybody who could pick up something like a pick or a shovel or a sword or a spear and get in the action, because they needed everybody present and accounted for. It says the Hivites up by Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is the farthest north landmark in Israel. So you always talk about Mount Hermon, you're talking about the very farthest north. And there were Hivites that lived in this valley up here, okay? And they came into the action. And then lastly, it says the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites of the hill country. And it's talking about the southern hill country. And the Jebusites and the Perizzites are the people who live in the vicinity of Jerusalem, Hebron, and Debir. Well, didn't we just conquer that? They did. Last week, they just conquered that. So sometime in the last year, it seems that those warriors were able to reoccupy their cities and their towns, and they were now a threat once again, and they put up an army into the field, and that army joined the coalition. So this was huge. It is the biggest battle that Joshua ever faced, okay? It struck fear into the people. And there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, it was huge. Secondly, it was at the waters of Merom, which are right on the edge of that big valley, okay? That big plain where you have a battle. And you can see chariots. The Israelites didn't have chariots. They had cavalry. Well, the Israelites didn't have a lot of that. But also in chapter 17, verse 18, it says their chariots were made of iron. Now, what you need to know is that this is existing at about the time that historians call the Bronze Collapse. Now, up to this point in time, the most popular metal for plows and swords and spears and so forth was bronze. Bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. It's very hard. It's a good metal, and it's what basically fueled the entire Bronze Age. You couldn't get iron and steel because you couldn't get a furnace that could get hot enough, okay? And about this time, there were economic and political issues that were a big collapse in the East, but also it was accompanied by the absence or the shortage of tin. So people couldn't make bronze. And so therefore, there was some incentive, and necessity being the mother of invention, various peoples began to figure out ways of smelting iron, because you have to get a hotter furnace. Iron's not as good as bronze if it's raw, but then somebody began to come up with the idea we can carbonize iron, and that creates steel. And steel is better, more plentiful. If you can smelt it, it's cheaper. And so we're at the juncture between these two. If Israel had any weapons, they would be bronze and they would be old. And these people had all the latest technology. Now, they said they were terrified, but they wouldn't be terrified by iron chariots just made of iron. Well, there was a new development, again, in military hardware, where they called them scythe chariots. This is probably a poor picture, but it's the one where you can see this blade coming out. Oh, they came out all kinds of different configurations. They existed up in Britain all the way down to Persia, and they were beginning to come online about this time. So you can imagine there's maybe dozens and dozens and dozens of these things out there, multiple horses, a couple of soldiers with swords, and they had these big blades sticking out maybe 3 feet, and some of them had a boom that was strapped across the horses and also had blades, and those blades would be made of steel. So the Israelites, I mean, they're like farmers compared to this. They're not, I mean, they're an army. They've won some battles. They're not impotent, but they've never seen anything like this. It has the greatest numbers, had the best technology, and they were up against it. Now, those are called scythe chariots. Now, that struck fear into Israel. So Joshua gets a message from God to encourage him. Chapter 11, verse 6.
The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them over to Israel, slain. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots."
Now, the word I in the Hebrew is in what's called the emphatic. This is just I. I will deliver you, says God. And the word to will deliver is in a participle, present participle. It says, I will be delivering you. In the midst of the battle, I will be the one who delivers you. Now, you'll notice in this particular campaign, there's no miraculous intervention. No hailstones from on high, no longer days, no walls crumbling down, or anything that we would consider supernatural. But nevertheless, God says, I am the one who gives you the victory. And that means that we need to be a little bit careful with all of our infatuation with our military and our technology and our great might. Because it is the moral component of war, and it is the God of heaven who determines the outcome. Now, God orders him to hamstring the horses and burn all the chariots. Is that what you do with enemy armaments when you get them? No, of course you don't, unless you can't use them. I mean, you would turn them right around and use them against the enemy himself, wouldn't you? Why does God say, burn the chariots, hamstring the horses, make them useless? Why does he say that?
Evidently, they're not going to need them.
That's right, not going to need them.
I think 2 reasons. Number one, whenever God tells Israel to destroy everything, that's a sign of his judgment on these people. But secondly, and really important, God wanted to demonstrate to the Israelite, to his people, that it was him, I, who did it. Not them, not any miraculous force. It was God who intervened on their part.
Yes, you hear this again and again in the Bible, especially the Psalms. Jack, read Psalm 33:16.
No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength.
You're all familiar with Psalm 20, verse 7 also. Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. If you ever listened to many speeches by Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, you would notice that he used the phrase Christian civilization. This war was a war for the preservation of Christian civilization. See, the Nazis were not only socialists and radicals, they also were turning toward ancient paganism, the gods of war. And there was a lot of that sort of thing going on. So there's a very clear difference between the civilization of the West that was traditionally out of Christendom and what the Nazis were provoking. And so he said, we are in war to save Christian civilization. He was essentially saying, our God is the Lord. And so he essentially was inveighing the favor of God and declaring that we are on his side. Can you imagine anybody doing that today? No. I really don't. As a matter of fact, if you say we are a Christian country, most secular people will really take issue with you. That's not true anymore. We're definitely a post-Christian country. So the moral component of war is the most important thing, and we ought to keep that in mind. So let's go on. Joshua now, he decides he's going to march from Gilgal up to Merom, and he's going to take them on. Jack?
So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Mizrephoth, Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots.
Now, if you've ever studied much about the Civil War, you know Stonewall Jackson was known for showing up where you never expected him. And it seems that Joshua was very much like this. Joshua could march overnight from Gilgal down to Gibeon and surprise all those kings and rout them. And I think he did something similar here. He came much faster than they ever dreamed. He surprised them and he routed the armies. Now, God has essentially done the same thing he's done before. He brought all the armies of all these cities out into one place so he could destroy them. And that is exactly what happened. And it says then that he routed and pursued and slaughtered them. And it says basically two directions, okay? And that would be north all the way up into Phoenicia. This coastal area is a commercial empire called the Phoenicians. Their capital city was Sidon. And then also over here into Mount Hermon, into Mizpah Valley where the Hivites were. And he chased them both in those directions with some portion of his army. And he slaughtered the army till it was gone. Then it says he turned around and came back to Hazor. And he destroyed the city. Same pattern as in the south. You take the combined armies of all these cities and you destroy it in the field. Then one by one, you go to their cities and you besiege them and you take them and you destroy them as well. So he routed the army, pursued them, and he came back and he then, it says, killed all the Canaanite kings. Verse 12, if you're looking at your Bible, we're 10 to 12. It says, Joshua took all these royal cities. That would be the cities where the king dwelt, and it would be heavily fortified, and their kings, and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds except Hazor, which Joshua burned. So Joshua burned and completely destroyed only 3 cities, Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And the rest, they would kill every living thing in there, every living human being in there, and then they would take the rest as plunder. That's the pattern that they had. But it says all the Canaanite kings. Now go to verse 18, and you see what it says. It says, so Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. For a long time. Now, how long? I mean, we don't know even how long it took him to get through Jericho, Ai, and into the south. Maybe a year. But this would be a much bigger task. And so how long did it take? And we get a little bit of this understanding of this from the story of the giants. So this seems to be, if you get to verse 18, 19, 20, it says, except Joshua waged war for a long time, except for the Hivites in Gibeon, which was made peace with. Not one city made a treaty of peace. He took them all in battle. It was the Lord himself. He destroyed them without mercy as the Lord had commanded Moses. That sounds like the end of the story, doesn't it? We're at the end of the northern campaign and it's done. But then somebody's appended another story, beginning in verse 21 to 23. Jack?
At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israel territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So Joshua took the entire land just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war.
Now, it says that Joshua went out and destroyed the Anakites. Who are the Anakites? Sometimes called the Anakim. Giants, right? Yeah. Now there's lots of giants. We talked about this in our series on Genesis, that they may have come genetically through one of Noah's son's wives, but there was still a genetic strain of gigantism, perhaps left over from before the flood. And that was primarily in Canaan. And they were called Rephaites, Anakim, Nephilim, Zamzumites, Emites, Horites, all kinds of ites. And there's been battles against them since Abraham's time. At this point, he drives them out of their strongholds in Debir, Hebron, and Jerusalem, and he pushes what few stragglers are left down into Philistia, and that is where David finds them. That's where Goliath came from, okay? Now, take a look at chapter 14. Okay? And Jack, let's read verse 6.
Now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me."
Now, Joshua's at Gilgal, in that central location, the blue triangle up there. Okay? He has subdued, remember, there's loads and loads of Canaanites, maybe millions of Canaanites, but he has essentially destroyed the political and military power and all resistance that he might have. And now it's time to do the surveys and award the land to the various tribes. I mean, we're down to like George Washington did in the Ohio Valley. You go and say, put a tomahawk mark on this tree and say by the great oak of this tree, you go to that tree and then you go to the other. That's why we're not going to spend a lot of time in the chapters up ahead because they read like a surveyor's logbook. But that's what he began to do. And naturally, the most powerful tribes, the tribes that had been most prominent in battle, would come to him first. And here's something interesting. Y'all know who Caleb was?
He was the spy.
The 2 faithful spies.
Okay, he was one of the 12 spies. Did you ever learn that song? 12 men went to spy on Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. It was a great song. Sorry. He was one of those. But here's what I want you to notice. It says, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. Now, what you don't know is Caleb wasn't an Israelite. He was not an Israelite. He did not belong to any of the tribes. He would have been one of that mixed multitude that joined Israel in Egypt and left. And he has joined himself to the nation of Israel. We don't know if he became a proselyte and was circumcised and all that stuff, but essentially, I don't think he was because he's not included as a member of Judah. He's got his own inheritance. I don't know of anybody else who was not an Israelite who had an inheritance. And I think they were arguing over this. Caleb was saying, Hebron, Debir, that hill country, that belongs to me. Moses promised that to me. And the elders of the tribe of Judah said, oh, no. This is Judah's land. We'll let you rent it, but that's all you can do. And he said, oh, no. That's my land. And so they all come to Joshua and they say, we want you to resolve this for us, Joshua. Okay? And here's what he says. Let me put one more thing. One thing we know about him and his attachment to Israel is he calls the Lord my God. My God. You see that in 7 and 8, where he says, my fellow Israelites went up with me and made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So he is one of God's children. So, okay, now let's go to 14 verse 9 and hear him make his case.
So on that day, Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly.
So Joshua says, sorry, boys, Caleb gets his inheritance. And it says that Moses told him he could have all the land that he set his foot on, that he had walked on when he was a spy. So we have to presume that he was part of the detachment that went up into the hill country where the giants were. Okay, and he saw Hebron, and he saw Debir, and he saw Jerusalem, and he says, I want that country. And so it was awarded to him. Moreover, you have to understand what a big deal this was. Who is buried in Hebron? No, Alvin, you can't. Anybody know?
Yeah. Abraham and Sarah.
Abraham and Sarah, but that's not all.
Joseph.
Who?
Joseph.
I'm not so good at hearing, guys.
Joseph.
Not Joseph, no. Joseph was buried in Shechem.
Jacob.
Jacob and Leah, not
Yeah, that's
Rachel,
right, Leah.
right? Isaac and Rebekah. The patriarchs' graves were by the oaks of Mamre, the place that Abraham bought from the Hittites. And that was now a Kenizzite's inheritance. Isn't that interesting? Alvin, now go ahead.
All the people who buried in that cave in the field of Machpelah were the bloodline that Jesus came from.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel was not included.
Yes, I know. You're right. And do you wonder then why Hebron is such a sensitive spot today? Boy, I tell you, It's pretty much dominated by the Palestinians. It's a place that you might want to visit, but you'd want to be real careful if you go up there. It's a very important place. So it belongs to Caleb. Now, Caleb now gives us the timeline. Chapter 14, 10 to 12.
Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there and the cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said.
It's been 45 years, he says, since he was at Kadesh Barnea. He was 40 at Kadesh when the spies went in. How long did they wander in the wilderness? Well, actually 38 years, and then they waged war for 2 years on the east of the Jordan against 2 Amorite kings, if you recall. That was Sihon and Og. Og was one of the giants also. He was a Rephaite. So 38 years in the desert, 2 years east of Jordan. So he must be at about the 5-year point. If this is the end of the northern campaign, then Joshua's wars to subdue Israel lasted 5 years. That's about right. It makes sense. Maybe 1 year for the south and Jericho and Ai, and maybe 4 years that they've been fighting in the north. And then it says that the land had rest from war. Now, I think that Caleb campaign against the sons of Anak is the same thing that we were talking about in chapter 11, 21, 22, where it says Joshua subdued all the giants in that land. Essentially, I think that means Joshua, who's the supreme commander and the head of state, he details the army or a portion of the army, a division or so, under Caleb, and Caleb takes care of the giants. I'll tell you, been at this for some time. The kings of Persia, Chedorlaomer, back in Abraham's day, fought the giants. The Edomites fought the giants. Ammon fought the giants. He is fighting the giants. And Moses fought them. Joshua is fighting them. David will fight them before we finally see them disappear from history. Giants are stubborn things, aren't they? They are difficult, and they keep coming back. Now, it says in verse 23, chapter 11 again, we're back there, okay? It says, so Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel. That must have taken some time, according to their tribal divisions, and then the land had rest from war. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of bloodshed, a lot of gore, a lot of terrible things for 5, 6, 7 years. Everybody's ready for this to be over, aren't they? And I don't blame them. Judgment by God's hand, when it finally comes, is harsh and unbearable. Jeremiah talks about it in chapter 47. He's talking about the awful things that will come upon Israel when Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians carry them off into captivity and destroy their nation as a judgment from God. And he says, alas, sword of the Lord, how long till you rest? Return to your sheath, cease and be still. So we tend to just not want to talk about impending judgment. But judgment eventually will come in response to our sin and our wickedness. The only comfort, I think, is that there is a time when it comes to an end. God's judgment is not forever. The flood, when it was over, Noah and his family emerged to a new and different world. In Revelation chapter 16, the last of the judgments is angel number 7 with the bowl, and it is the worst of all. It says that the earth is convulsed and there is a giant earthquake such as the world had never seen before, and that includes the flood, okay? And he pours it out, and then he says, it is done. That's a comfort to me, that God will dispense his judgment in little things as well as big things. But as it says in the Psalms, it says, weeping endures for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And I think that's what Israel was looking for. All the power structures have been decapitated. Their armies were destroyed. Their giant champions have basically been driven out. And the rest of the people, and there were lots of them. I think if I've gained one appreciation, I used to be so hard on the Israelites. Well, why didn't they just drive all the Canaanites out? And that wasn't easy. I mean, there were, we knocked out maybe 30, 40 royal cities. And there probably were hundreds more villages and cities and towns that still had Canaanites in them, and they were going to have to live amongst them. I like the way it's put in this one commentator's quote. He says, the Canaanites were so thoroughly cowed and dispirited that they dared offer no further resistance to the Israelites in their task of portioning out the land. They were quite contented to live in peace in such of their cities which remained, and had no disposition to court an overthrow such as took place at the battles of Gibeon and Merom, with its inevitable results of the absolute extermination not only of everyone who took up arms, but of every human being in the city to which they belonged. Thus, the Israelites were able to give their whole attention to the survey and apportionment of the territory. Now, that statement, the end of chapter 11, divides this book into two halves. The first half is what we have basically been studying, the military conquest and subjugation of the nations of Canaan. Not that they were all driven out, that'd be impossible. But all of the political and military power structure was destroyed. The rest will deal basically or mostly with the division of the land. Now, the chart on the left here shows you what Joshua has given to all of the tribes. There will be some lessons to gain from that next week when we finish up. But you'll notice that this is what Joshua gave them. By the time we hit this point, this is pretty much what they actually occupied. You notice there's some things missing, and we'll see that in chapter 13. There's all of Philistia. Remember the mention of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gath. And that's where the giants fled to. And there's also this whole area up in here, Geshur and Bashan, sometimes called Gilead. And that was still empty. That hadn't been occupied. And it's very instructive to see the folks from Manasseh whine and cry about the land that they wanted up there. But we'll do that next week. Now,
why does it say in 11:23, so Joshua took the entire land? I mean, he really didn't take the entire land.
it depends on how you look at it. I mean, he essentially broke the power of all the land except Philistia. And it says that he gave, we'll see this next week, he gave those lands in faith, knowing they would eventually subdue them, okay? And they did under David, but it took a long time, okay? And it does say in chapter 12 and 13 what was left over to be done. So I think that's in a general sense, that he essentially in general took the whole nation. Now, for you ladies who don't care about maps and calculators and military expeditions and all the details of that stuff, I apologize, and we've gotten through it. We're done with that. And you have to ask yourself the question, so what? Why am I looking at all this? Why is this recorded? Well, in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6, the Apostle Paul, speaking of Israel's experience in the wilderness, he says, now these things happened as examples for us, so we should not crave the evil things as they also craved. The unique thing about the Bible is that it's not a book of philosophical speculation, of moral exhortation, of fantasy, stories of the gods. It is a story, by and large, that is historical, because the God who created heaven and earth operates and does mighty deeds on the earth for a reason. Now, there are some who say, well, it doesn't matter if those things never really happened, but we can still gain a lesson from them. And down that road, there are monsters. God did do these things. We can count on the truth of his word, okay? And he does them uniquely in a way that pastors can use them as illustrations for their sermon. I mean, put it that simply, right? They're examples for us. I mean, there's no end to the depths of the mind that you can drill down. I mean, we've had Len's series on the feasts, and he's going to pick that up again in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. There's lots to be found in that. I like his exposition of Genesis 1, 1, and 2, where he says Genesis 1, 1, and 2 in creation talks about how God saves a soul. And it says in the beginning there's darkness, then the Spirit moves, light comes, and God separates the light from the darkness. Did I get it right?
Amen.
Whew, I've listened. All right. All right. Yeah. Well, Noah's Ark. What does Noah's Ark represent? What do we learn from that about God and about man? Well, we learn that salvation is only to the people in the ark. The only people who are saved from God's horrible, terrible judgment are in that ark. And the ark oftentimes is referred to as Jesus. The ark, the architect of the ark is God. He's the one who decides how it's to be done. He's the one who draws the world to himself and puts them all in the ark. And he's the one who shuts them in. There's coming a day when he will shut the door on the ark. And it doesn't matter what you ask him after that. If you are not in that ark, you are lost forever. And it's going to be a very, very sobering day. So the passengers pass through a terrible judgment and they emerge into a brand new land. That's what we expect to do. If your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life, you will pass through the great judgment and you will live in a new heavens and a new earth. God says, I am creating everything new and his dwelling is with men. I have no idea what that means, but I am looking forward to it and pray for it to happen. Any others that you can think of that would be used as a lesson from the Old Testament? There's one Jesus used you, I think of.
Lessons from the Old Testament.
Jonah. Exactly. What did Jesus say? Caroline?
Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days. So will the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth.
Okay. As Jonah spent 3 days and nights in the belly of the great fish, even so the Son of Man will spend 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Now, Jonah had no clue that that's what he was teaching, did he? God used that. He did that for a purpose immediately in Jonah's life to get his attention and get him out to Nineveh. But he also put that in the history books for us to learn from. So this is true of all of these things that we've been studying, that God has lessons for us to learn. I'm going to just give us about 3 today from what we've seen so far. First of all, there are 2 kinds of defeat. Ai was the result of willful disobedience, right? Achan kept those things that were devoted to God and he hid them in his tent. And as a result, Israel lost the battle. And what did they do to fix it?
They purged the sin.
Well, what was the remedy for Achan's sin? He was stoned.
Yeah.
Right? And those things were taken out. Now, that's pretty extreme. But when we tolerate willful disobedience in our lives, we should not expect victory. Okay? And when we do that, the answer, Tony, I'm going to let you talk a second, okay? The answer to our predicament is confession and repentance and the punishment of that sin. And fortunately for you and me, that punishment was poured out on Jesus. Tony, you got a comment?
Yeah, it's the attitude of God towards it. He says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. He wants us to kill the sin, not tolerate it.
Yeah.
Not treat it like a little puppy, but kill it.
Yeah. That's applicable to me in my own personal life. It's applicable in our families. It's applicable in the church. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about how one of the members of the church had been sleeping with his father's wife. And that was intolerable. That was wicked. And he said, do something about it. And then in 2 Corinthians, he says, what wonderful repentance. What wonderful grief that you displayed as you threw the guy out. And he did. He did. They threw him out of the church. And then later on, he said, bring him back in when he repents and gets forgiveness. So if we tolerate willful disobedience, we are not going to find victory until we repent of our sin and it is removed. But then Gibeon. Now Gibeon, that was a subterfuge. And I could understand Josh was awfully busy. They brought this delegation to him and the councils dealt with it. They ran it through the committees and they said, well, we got this charter here. We're gonna get some tribute from this city. It's way out. It's way far away. And so Joshua signs it, and I don't blame him. But as a result, he failed to fulfill God's plan for Israel. And they had to give up territory. They had to give up the plunder. They lost a lot because he just wasn't careful enough. Have you ever fallen because you were not on your guard? 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. King Henry VIII was asked, about, was it Thomas Becket, I think it was, that he wanted to have killed? He said, who's going to rid me of this troublesome priest? And he asked his courtiers, what is he afraid of? And they said, sir, he's afraid of nothing except sin. And we would do well to be on our guard consistently. But it's also comforting to know that he can bring good out of evil. And we saw that with Gibeon. They became water carriers and woodcutters for the temple. And there's a long record of them being faithful to Israel. I love that song. Has that line in it. And when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. When I'm weak and I don't have it in me and I fall and I make a mistake and I stumble into sin, I will fall on your grace. I will fall on your forgiveness. And it is a great comfort to know that that is available to me. So there's a lesson for us. But then there's also a progression of victory. You notice how this works out? First of all, Jericho, highly supernatural, right? Joshua didn't have much to do except clean up. I mean, it was a done deal. And it was all of God, not anything of Joshua. And then in the southern campaign, it began with supernatural assistance, right? You had the hailstones, you had the long day. But the hailstones and the long day wouldn't have been of any use if Joshua wasn't fighting the battle, right? So he had to fight. He had to do battle with the enemy. But he got some supernatural assistance. And then in the northern campaign, which was the biggest campaign, there were no miracles, was it? It was Joshua and the army, and God gave him the victory without the miraculous. No. Why is that? And I wish I had an answer because I thought of this a lot. Why does God seem to want to wean us off of the spectacular and the miraculous? Think about the church when it was brand new. I mean, it said that Peter would walk down the street and people would be healed because they were in his shadow, for Pete's sake. And that doesn't happen so much today. It seems that God wants to wean us from those things. Why?
To mature us.
Can't hear you.
To mature us.
Mature us? Well, what's mature mean?
I think he wants to be dependent on faith.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The just shall live by faith. We walk by faith and not by sight. And somehow that is pleasing to the Lord. That we serve him when it isn't obviously necessary. Otherwise, we'd all be mercenaries. I'll serve the Lord because I want to be rich. I'll serve the Lord, I want him to heal me. I'll serve the Lord because he's going to miraculously bless my business. That's health, wealth, and prosperity. No. He wants us and he is honored. Like with Job, when we suffer and serve him in spite of the enemy being on top of everything. Now, just following that northern campaign with no miraculous intervention, there's still the giants, isn't there? Like we said before, those pesky things keep coming up. They're stubborn. They are not easy to take. I mean, they're giants, for Pete's sake. And I think the message here is that God will prepare you as you grow in faith to deal with the giants in your life. Now, there are lots of ways to look at this. And I've got Len's permission to use this, but I remember many years ago that Len, he had a tough childhood. He had a father who was abusive. His mother died when he was young. He lived a pretty rough life. All he wanted to do was get out of home. And he finally did. He lived a typical secular man's life till he met the sainted Gigi. Actually, met her mother and dad. And it was Gigi's mom who told him about Jesus and demonstrated the love of Christ to him. And he became a Christian, but he had a lot to clean up. Gigi could probably tell us he still has a bunch to clean up, but we don't know. But anyway, he had habits to break. He had friends to change. He had to change his haunts. He had to study and learn because he lacked knowledge. We benefit from all that today, don't we? Sure. But there was always a giant that was standing in the way. And that was he needed to reconcile with his dad. And I remember he prayed for a long time about that. I believe I was praying with you on that at one point. I'm sure the Lord was saying, Len, you got to go see Dad. And I'm sure Len said, I'm not ready. And the Lord is saying, Len, I brought you through all these things. We've cleaned up this, we've cleaned up that, we've changed this, we've won a lot of battles. You are ready for this. And so he made a few trips up north. And would you say that that was a great blessing to have met with your dad, to have told him you forgave him, to have reconciled with him before he died? Yeah. Enormous blessing. I think that's a good illustration. There are things that are always going to be in front of us that we're going to say, I can't get over that. Whether it's a sin in our life or whether it's a task God has called us to do, nonetheless, that's the giant. And they're stubborn and they keep coming back, and God will continuously confront us with them. Now, I want you to understand something. A lot of times, the strength and the power of the giants is in the fear that they produce in our hearts. They're not all that great. God has given us all the strength we need to overcome them, but their power is in the fear they inspire. We often find that the worst ills are those that eventually never happen. And here's a great quote I want to read for you. Speaking of these giants, remember, there is some distance between you and them, and much may happen before you reach them. You are gathering strength every step you take on the right road, and every lesser victory is giving you force and nerve to win a greater one. And should the giants not die before you get to them, you will find that, like Israel, you have grown fit to fight them before you are called to fight them. Isn't that comforting? Leonard.
Barb, what's interesting about this is that when you face giants, I think you have one of two reactions. You can have fear of the giants, or you can have anger towards the giants. In Joshua's case, he was angry, but God grabbed him and used him to spite himself and kept bringing him back to the point where he had to face the giant. And that was Nineveh. He didn't want Nineveh to get saved. I didn't want my father to get saved. I wanted him to die and go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And I prayed for 4 years, and I was frustrated every time I tried to talk to him. And I remember praying, and God revealed to me that wasn't a mistake, that God took 4 years to prepare my heart. And to want my father to also be saved. I didn't leave until the Lord, my brother did. But I'm thankful that he did. And that released me to be a human being.
Wow, that is awesome. Great. Thanks for letting us use that one. Appreciate it. Well, I'll leave you with the essential attitude that we should have. First of all, verse 18 says, Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. And the message in that is victory over sin in a personal life, over evil in an organization like a family or a church or a nation is a gradual process. We are in this for the long haul. I remember when George Bush led us into the war in Iraq, and everybody thought, mission accomplished, we're going to go knock them dead. And Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, and he put a memo out to his subordinates that said, this is not going to be over quickly. This is going to be a long slog. And he was absolutely right. We're still embroiled in this war against terrorism. The promised land was supposedly a land of milk and honey. And it was. It was. But it was also a land of war and battle. There was a lot to do to expel these Canaanites, to take their gods and destroy them. So although God promises us blessings, and he gives us blessings in the Christian life, we need to recognize that we must struggle. This life is a war against evil, against sin, against temptation. And what we need to watch out for is what Francis Schaeffer once said is going to be the high value item in the American Christian's life in the years to come. And he is so right. and it is personal peace and affluence. Think about what we pray for. Lord, bless us here. Lord, bless us there. Lord, heal this, heal that. Make my child well. Bless me when I travel and keep me safe. Now, I realize in public, that's probably the thing we need to focus on because we don't have that much confidence in sharing what's in our heart. But Lord, give me victory over this evil thing in my heart. Give us victory in this church over the error that is spreading. Give us victory in this country over the 60+ million babies that have been killed and the killing that's going on. There will never be an end to the battle that we have to wage against sin and evil in this life. Hebrews 12, 3 and 4, two of my best verses. I used to read them to my kids, and you'll see why in a minute. He says, consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Think about Jesus. Okay? He endured an awful lot of opposition. He went to the cross. And I've said this to men who have said to me, well, I'm going to leave my wife because you just don't know how hard it is living with that woman. And I say, what the next verse says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Have you shed your blood? Have you taken the hits that you should take? Have you endured opposition? We need to remember it's a long, long war. And then it says in verse 19, except for the Hivites living in Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites who took them all in battle. Joshua never made peace with God's enemies. We should never make peace with God's enemies. We're going to fail. We may fail at the same point again and again and again. I use the illustration of trying to move upstream in a river. If you just lift your feet up and drift with the river, you don't know how strong the current is. But you put your feet down and try to move upstream, and you'll realize how strong it is. And there are going to be times when you fall and you stumble and you get bruised on the rocks. But the key is, when you stand up, which way are you facing? Are you facing upstream? Or are you facing downstream? We never want to cease the fight. I was talking to a friend of mine who was saying he was about ready to leave his wife. And I said, don't ever retire from the field of battle. Marriage could be a battle. Not between you and your spouse, but between you and the sin that is in your life or your spouse's life, for which you must bear the burden of intercession and concern and unconditional love. It is a battle. Never make peace with God's enemies. Next week, we're going to finish Joshua. We'll go through the Surveyor's Handbook with a map a little bit. And there are still moral lessons, spiritual lessons to be learned, even in the division of the land. And of course, Joshua's final exhortation to the people of Israel is something we all could benefit from. So we'll look forward to finishing our series next week.